Good afternoon. My name is Jesse Driscoll, and I'm here to reflect a little on the challenge of conflict and how it's studied at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We take on big public policy questions at GPS, and scientifically informed public policy is obviously our brand here. But I wanted to reflect a little bit on what that means for those of us who study topics in international security. I think that there are basically four constitutive components. We have big questions, clear answers, an interdisciplinary approach to the values of searching, and then careful observation. And I think of these as shared values. I think that they're well calibrated to innovating arguments that can make it through various policy filters. So I'm going to talk about each of them very briefly. Big questions. In the course of the classes that we teach, and in a lot of subtle ways, I think that we do encourage people here to ask very, very big questions, and you've seen that throughout the event. The questions of war and peace are inherently interesting and normatively important. It's not hard to convince people that wars determine the fate of nations and peoples and places, and from time to time, and especially since the nuclear revolution, perhaps even the fate of the whole species. It's easy to convince people of that because it's probably true. Second, we value clear answers. In science, we don't hand out awards for asking questions that we cannot answer. Third, we don't restrict the process of searching for compelling explanations within the confines of one discipline. And I think that is one of the main strengths of GPS, is that it's not cheap talk here. We actually value innovation, and part of how we value innovation is searching for solutions outside of a single discipline. We bring together tools from the natural sciences, and we bring them into conversations with the social sciences. This doesn't always work, but GPS is eons ahead of the curve on interdisciplinary collaboration and respect, and interdisciplinary searching works best when it's problem-driven, not methods-driven. And when it works, it's really very great. It's very impressive. Fourth and finally, and in a lot of ways this is just a summary of the second and third points, everyone who works on security here at GPS really values the scientific method. The second step of the scientific method is observation. And we send very costly signals to each other that we are taking observation extremely seriously all the time, everywhere we go. Now, the methods we use for observation vary. For some of us, it means spending a lot of time in the field and really getting to know our subjects face to face. And for others, it means taking extremely careful care in the collection and curation of large samples of survey data, so that instead of getting to know a few people really well, you get to know a lot of people, but then are very conservative about the claims that you make about what they know and what they believe, and what the gap is between what they say they believe and what they really believe. There's also some people whose observations are close examinations of one or two countries, others whose most powerful kinds of inference come from identifying common mechanisms across many cases. But for all of us, I think we share an appreciation that closely observing conflict and war is not always pleasant. So our obligation to scholars, with this really unusual privilege of being able to have such great students and so many resources, unusual job security, but then study something that's both fascinating and horrifying and terrible, is that it ought to be useful. It ought to try, or at least aspire to be of use. It's difficult to know how to do that, admittedly, in security studies, because for a lot of these problems, we can agree on quite a lot, but when it comes to the challenge of conflict, still many of the truths we cling to depend a great deal on our own point of view. So concretely, we spend a lot of money on national defense in this country. US taxpayers subsidize the military quite generously. We've been feeding the meter since the 1940s. We never really thought about stopping. We could spend less. Could we spend less and be still pretty secure in the United States? Yeah, probably. Could we spend the money smarter? I mean, surely. But what does it mean to spend it smarter? It's not always clear. Should we be getting better at small wars and state building for either humanitarian or strategic reasons? Or should we decide that the problems are just insoluble and try to stay out of quagmires and minimize our liability over outcomes that we already know scientifically are likely to be bad? There's actually no clear answer to that. And rhetorical tricks on one side or the other don't always carry the day. Should we focus with intensity on nuclear non-proliferation and multilateral arms control? Because that's where the big risk policy failures might actually end in species side. Or is that all doomed to failure anyway? So you might as well get lower hanging fruit. Should we focus on China? And how should we focus on China without setting off spiraling arms races and security dilemmas? How do we even talk about China without setting off arms races and security dilemmas? Talking about submarines, talking about smart dust. Are we past the point of no return on the weaponization of outer space? All of these sound like very, very big questions because they are very, very big questions. And that leaves out a whole bunch of other things. But it also leaves out a different way to think about security, which is human security. It's not clear whether we're ever actually going to get back any of the civil liberties that were given away after September 11th, because I think a lot of people really are worried, and reasonably so, about the threat of dark networks and hardened cells armed with really terrible weapons. And mass surveillance, the set of policy debates that occur at the intersection of national security and civil liberties are very, very serious. On the other hand, if it's too late to go back, it's also reasonable to ask, I think reciprocally, at what point it becomes possible to think preventatively about doing something about mass casualty shootings. I'm really sad to report that there was a mass casualty shooting just down the road in Poway at the Chabad synagogue. There's 1 dead, 3 wounded. They haven't released the name of the victim or very much about the identity of the shooter, but our hearts and thoughts are with the victims, and give blood. With that, we do ask big questions here. We think hard about conflict and security, and we are talking, when we talk about security, about what kind of society we want to build at home, what kind of culture we want to subsidize in the military, and all of us are very serious people doing very serious work. So it's a true honor and privilege to be able to introduce my professional colleagues. We'll start with Ming Cheung. He is an associate professor at GPS, director of the IGCC. He is a longtime analyst and leading security expert on China and East Asian defense and national security affairs, especially related to economic, industrial, technology, and innovation issues. Every year, I teach students who ask me, how far out are we from an actual hegemonic clash between the United States and a rising China? And I usually just wave my hands and say something like, I don't know, a couple decades, maybe more than a couple decades. I don't know, China's got a lot of history in front of it. And then I just stop and see if they ask a follow-up question. And if they don't, then I sound really smart. And if they ask a follow-up question at all, I just say, look, go talk to Ming. I have no idea. So in all seriousness, Ming Cheung.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about China, and that's the reason. Now, I knew that there was a reason why students kept coming to my door, and now I know it's because it's Jesse itself. So when I first started studying China and its military and technological power in the 1970s, I think this was when I was from kindergarten onwards. So that's how I like to think about it itself. And I went and I talked to the professors who looked at this area or looked at security studies in general. And they said, it's like, well, your topic, this was in the 70s and even in the 80s, is about as relevant as the study of Greenland as a beach destination. And I said, okay, I may be on the wrong track, but I'm going to persist because I think at some point it's going to be relevant today. And fortunately or unfortunately, today, the issue of China's military and technological rise has tumbled sort of from the back pages to the front pages of both the media, of policy and scholarly dialogue itself. And also, should I add, the study of Greenland as a beach resort has also become relevant because of climate change itself. So I'm in good company. And one of the big questions that have come out is, like, I mean, as Jesse sort of mentioned earlier, is are we, it's like, seeing the US and China going to go to war itself? So if anyone sort of followed some of the scholarly writings, there's issues like Graham Allison's validity trap. But the area that I don't actually think that China and the US is going to go into an actual armed kinetic conflict itself. What is more likely, and what we're actually already seeing, is the beginnings or the early chapters of what people are beginning to call a Cold War itself. I mean, what we've seen in the last few years, and particularly accelerated in the last year, is like we see the trade frictions, the economic, the geopolitical, and geostrategic issues. And the US officially, it's like in the last year or so, the US government has designated that we're in an era today of great power competition, particularly with China and with Russia itself. So what I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of context and then look at what we mean by sort of what is understanding China in this context of, are we in this Cold War? Because it's a useful term, and there's a historical reference point, but it's actually very, very different. And understanding the differences helps us to sort of begin to pass and sort out what are the challenges and how do we think about it over the next few decades. So the first Cold War that began was in the second half of the 20th century. It was between the Soviet Union and the US, and this took place from the 1950s right up to the beginning of the 1990s itself. And that was sort of a military ideological clash itself, and that was all-consuming. But there was another dimension, and that was what we called the geo-economic. And that was sort of in the 1980s, with the rise of Japan as a technological and an investment and an economic power. And in many ways, this is what was behind the establishment of GPS back in the late 1990s, to study what the Japanese competition meant for the US and for the global order. But the important thing was that this was very compartmentalized. So you had the Soviet Union in this security sphere, and you had Japan on the geo-economic sphere. And there was a very deep divide for political and strategic reasons, etc. There wasn't much of an overlap between them itself. So it's like the big word from this is that the first Cold War was a very compartmentalized affair. Today, what we're seeing with the rise of China, both from an economic and from a strategic and from a military and from a technological perspective, is that China represents a very different challenge to the US. Whereas, on the one hand, the first Cold War was very much of a compartmentalized competition. China represents a very integrated challenge to the US and the rest of the world. It represents both on the national security side, on the defense and military side itself, as well as on the economic. But China is more than just the sum of the Soviet Union and Japan. If China today was the sum of the Soviet Union and Japan, it would be relatively easy because a lot of the legacy approaches that we dealt with during the Cold War, like export controls or investment controls, we could apply to China. But sort of what I think is the main challenge today is sort of like in the middle, the convergence between the defense and the economic, the commercial, to what we call the civil military, and the rise of the emerging core strategic technologies. Because this is one of the areas that China is paying particular attention to. And this represents a very big challenge because this is a very blurred area itself. What used to be in the Cold War, we could sort of very clearly distinguish what was sort of military, or what was commercial. Today it's very blurred. It's like a lot of it was what we call dual use. It has both civil and military applications. This particularly applies to a lot of the emerging areas. And sort of to understand this is we need to understand sort of what is the nature of the Chinese state in all this. And this is a useful environment because I'm going to be able to sell my book, because my book coming up is on what I call the Chinese techno-security state itself. And I'm going to give a very brief overview itself, because the Chinese techno-security state, when we begin to understand it, we begin to understand what are the different actors and what are different elements. Because, I mean, today in the headlines, some of the challenges are, it's like, I mean, we see issues of, it's like this Chinese technology company called Huawei, right? So what is Huawei? If you look at what the US government says, Huawei is a national security threat itself. If you talk to consumers in the rest of the world, they say, well, Huawei, they make some of the best smartphones, etc. It's a commercial enterprise itself. Is it one or the other, etc.? And one of the things for us to begin to understand is understanding what the Chinese techno-security state is. The Chinese techno-security state, which is sort of how technology and innovation and security is beginning to become increasingly integrated. So what you have is that, especially since Xi Jinping has come to power, since the early 2010s, he's made a major effort to emphasize the importance of national security, both externally and domestically, such as like building up the Chinese military power, building up the surveillance and monitoring and control capability domestically. There's also the build-up of traditional defense industrial complex, which is pouring out a lot of KKK capabilities. But it's the rise of this dual use, what strategic innovation system that is focusing on this convergence between the commercial and military, that is really the most fascinating part itself. Xi Jinping is very much engaged in this. He heads a number of entities that are focused upon this. Almost every month he talks about this, etc. And it's like, and this is one of the areas that is very, very little understood. There's very little research. In fact, in the US, there's about 3 or 4 people who are studying this, and none of them are in the Defense Department itself. So, I mean, it's because it's like we need to understand. It's like these issues about it's like where are the boundaries, right? And how do we understand it? So, it's so domestically, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership talks about how we're going to fuse and converge the military and the commercial portions of the economy to create this dual-use, very integrated, state-led economy. Externally, the Chinese authorities say, don't pay attention to any of that. It's like our companies, the investment firms, etc., they're all commercial. They don't have any ties to the national security apparatus. And some of that might be true, etc. The US, what we see, especially this administration and the national security apparatus here, they are viewing sort of the China view, threat sort of as a black and white, right? It's like, well, obviously it's a national security, and we need to take an absolute approach, so have a complete decoupling. While a lot of the US allies, we've seen this week the UK, but Germany and others who say, well, it's, we should take a relative view about what China represents. Yes, there are national security issues, but China and its commercial companies and the technologies that they come, there's a lot of economic benefits and interests. So what we see is these different debates that are taking place, the US, in China, and the rest of the world. And these debates are fierce, and whoever gets to have the final say to define this will have a profound impact on shaping how the global technology order, and by reference also the economic order, what is this going to come out to be? Are we going to have the continuing status quo, a partial or a complete decoupling? And I think a school like GPS is critical as a venue to understand this, because it's not just about military or security issues, right? This is about issues of technology, about political economy, and it's about looking at all these things holistically. And so these are the types of things that we're doing here to be able to say, when we go to Washington, D.C., and we talk to the policymakers, and we say, well, it's like, I mean, you don't really, it's like when you paint China in black and white, this is not really very, very helpful itself. We need to have a much more nuanced view itself. It's sort of the equivalent when I talk to the Defense Department. It's like, well, you take a World War II approach. When you sort of, it's like in the bombing campaigns in World War II, you carpet bombed a lot of sort of your opponents in Germany, etc. And there's a massive collateral damage, etc. Perhaps what you should do is more like today, when you should be much more precise in how you deal with these threats, etc. And it's like, and they don't have the analytical tools or the frameworks or even the evidence to come. And so this is the things that we're trying to do today itself. And I'll leave it on that. Thank you. Thanks, Jesse.
Okay, next up is Professor Steven Haggard, Steph Haggard, the way as he's affectionately known to me. Steph is the Lawrence and Sally Cruz Professor of Korea-Pacific Studies, Director of the Korea-Pacific Program, and Distinguished Professor of Political Science at GPS. He has written extensively on transitions to and from democratic rule, political economy of economic reform, social policy and globalization, and a host of other topics. He is a titan of political science, according to every quantitative and qualitative measure that you would use to validate that claim. In addition to multiple books, chapters, papers, and witnesses, and papers, he is also the primary author of the Witness and Transformation blog, which has been covering North Korean issues for a long time. Steph Haggard.
Thanks very much. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is I've already lied to you. I'm not going to talk about negotiating with North Korea. I'm not going to tell you what happened in Singapore. I'm not going to tell you what happened in Hanoi. I'm going to tell a somewhat different story, which is about information. And this picture, which has virtually become a cliche, I think most of you have probably seen this at some point, is really a metaphor for the problem of North Korea, which is anytime you're negotiating with an adversary, you have to understand their intentions and capabilities. And North Korea is a virtual black hole with respect to information. And so the question, which if you're a physicist, of course you know this is impossible, is how do you extract information from a black hole? And it's totally by coincidence, a reporter called me this morning from The Economist, and they asked me about this picture, because this picture is usually taken as a metaphor or an explanation, really, of what went wrong in North Korea compared to what went wrong in China and South Korea. But in fact, it's also got information in it, because the night lights that are shown here, the emission of light, can be used to construct estimates of economic activity over time by mapping the course of those changes in luminosity over time. And there's a group in Vienna which has tried to do this, called the World Data Lab, headed by a guy named Homi Karas, that many of us know here at GPS. And he was asking me, what do you think of these estimates? And I said, don't know. So let me really just give you some examples of the type of things that people are doing, myself included and others, to try to get at this question of extracting information from a black hole. And I'm going to start with things that are very simple, and then I'm going to move to things which are more complex in real time and that characterize where the field has moved over the last several years. So the first thing I'm going to show you, because I can't help it, I'm not as bad as my colleagues on data. I said that yesterday. But I do find this a really interesting exercise. So North Korea publishes absolutely no trade statistics. They treat them as a state secret. So the only way you can get estimates of what North Korea's trade looks like is to essentially take a look at all of the countries that are trading with North Korea and reconstruct their direction of trade from their trading partners. And that's this exercise in mirror statistics. And in a recent book I did in sanctions, I and others have done this simple exercise, but it really actually provided a very important insight into what's happened in North Korea since the nuclear crisis started, which is with the imposition of sanctions, North Korea has become more and more dependent on the Chinese economy. The red line that you see here. It's just gone steadily up. And China now accounts for about 85 to 95% of North Korea's trade. And of course, just knowing that means that we knew that China, in fact, had substantial influence over North Korea, despite what they were saying to the contrary. So obviously, this is just baseline information that's important to know. We can also get information out of North Korea by interviewing refugees. And this has been a tried and true method for understanding what's happening in socialist countries. In Hong Kong, this was an industry in Hong Kong with respect to China, and of course the Soviet Union as well. And I always like to show these pictures of markets in North Korea, because one of the things that happened after the Great Famine of the early 90s is that North Koreans started to move and started to engage in trade and commerce of various sorts for the purpose of staying alive. And now you see both these kind of informal markets on the left and these more structured markets on the right, in which the government is seeking to tax those that are involved in these activities. But some surveys that we did of North Korean refugees that had escaped gave us some insight into how pervasive this sort of market activity is. We found, for example, that 70% of the refugees, admittedly a select group, reported that most of their income came from market activity. And this is in a state socialist economy. So we know that this is a country which is changing quite dramatically, but the only way we can figure that out is to talk to those who are leaving. Probably the biggest change that's happened over the last several years is the growth of satellite imagery and a series of platforms that permit outside researchers using open source information to analyze what's happening on North Korea by looking at satellite imagery. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute, but one of the biggest findings that we have from this satellite information, and this is again open source unclassified information, is that North Korea's missile tests, which started at a handful of major test sites, have now been emanating from all over the country, suggesting that these missiles are actually deployed down to the unit level. This is an important strategic thing to know. We know exactly where these things are coming from, we know that they're dispersed, and we know that that poses a particular security challenge. And these kinds of issues of using satellite imagery extend way beyond the security sphere to things like human rights. I've been interested throughout the time I've been working on North Korea and human rights issues, how we promote human rights. And in the course of submitting information to the Commission of Inquiry, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea, one of the things I saw from some of my colleagues who work at the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea are these incredible projects on the concentration camps in North Korea. And we now have satellite imagery of those camps. We know approximately how many people are in them. And by triangulating that satellite imagery with interviews with refugees, we can find out what exactly was happening in these camps. So these are really, and of course, you've probably seen pictures of places where, missile sites and things like that as well. But this one image I think is really interesting because it's showing where the satellite imagery is going. These are two images which were taken 1 minute apart, 1 minute apart. So we're now down to being able to watch things in near real time. And if we want to know something about North Korea's intentions, this picture actually is very revealing because this is a monument that was built in honor of the long-run missile launches that North Korea undertook in 2017. You think they're going to give these things up? We actually think that Kim Jong-un is in this delegation, which you can see worming across this huge edifice which has been constructed to honor this missile launch. So even intentions of adversaries can be gleaned in part by gaining this type of information. I've only got a few seconds, and so let me show you some hieroglyphs because this is some work from a group that I'm currently negotiating an agreement so our students can work for them. But big data is also starting to play a very interesting role in what we know about North Korea. Each one of these little hieroglyphs is based on the following proposition. There's one firm in each of these groups which has been granted a license by the Russian government to import North Korean labor. And through the screening of publicly available evidence, this group was able to put together maps of how these firms were layered into multiple holding companies and fake holding companies that would hide who the ultimate beneficiaries were of that imported Korean labor in violation of sanctions. And so I'll close out by saying that if you want to ask me what I think is going on with negotiations with North Korea, I'm happy to tell you about that. But we can only go into those negotiations and make sense if we're able to understand what's going on in these types of places that are black holes. Thanks very much.
Next up is Lauren Prather. Lauren is an assistant professor of political science here at GPS. Her work focuses on the domestic determinants of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, democracy promotion, and democratization in the Middle East. She uses experimental methods, and she's writing a book on how foreign countries influence or allegedly influence other countries' elections.
Voting is an act of trust. I want you all to think about the last time you voted. I'm going to assume that this room votes, okay? If you don't, you should. So think back to the last time you voted. In 2018, I went to my local polling station, something that I actually hadn't done in a very long time. I voted, I selected my candidates, I put it in the ballot box, and I walked out. In 2016, I wasn't able to go to the polling stations. I was 40 weeks pregnant. My daughter was literally due on election day, so she has no choice now but to become a political scientist. And so I voted by mail, not wanting to risk the fact that I might not be able to vote in person. And so that required me to fill out my ballot at home and send it off in the mail. 2 previous presidential elections, I voted in from a foreign country and submitted my ballot via mail across the Atlantic to wherever it landed. Now, what I want to submit to you today is that each of those acts was an act of trust. Even as a political scientist, I still don't really understand the process by which my ballot makes its way to the final vote count. We know how a bill becomes a law, but we don't really know how a ballot becomes a vote. Now, thinking about the 2016 election, I couldn't believe it when I heard that Trump won. Now, this isn't just like a, OMG, I can't believe it. This is, I really couldn't believe that he won. Accepting the results of an election is also an act of trust. This is what I study. I study trust in elections and why people may or may not trust the outcome. So there are 3 basic reasons that we've come to describe why some people trust elections and others don't. The first is expectations. So we knew before the 2016 election that there was a low probability that Trump might win, but a low probability doesn't mean no probability. So if you have high expectations that an outcome is going to be in one direction, but you observe the opposite, reconciling that worldview can be difficult and can lead to lower trust. The second thing that can affect people's trust in elections are institutions. People may not trust the electoral process. They have doubts about the fairness of the electoral playing field, and this can cause them to doubt the ultimate outcome. The third reason is vote choice. If I support the winning candidate, I think the world has never been rosier. I completely trust what just happened because it conforms to my worldview. But if I support a losing candidate, I have a more difficult cognitive process to go through. I supported a losing candidate, but before they lost, I thought they were the best thing in the world. I thought everyone else around me must also think they're the best in the world. And so when I see a result that doesn't conform to that worldview, I think there must have been something wrong with the process that generated that result. So these 3 things have been present in the research on trust in elections for some time. And my work has now evolved to introduce a 4th factor. And of course, being at GPS, that factor is international relations. So I study how foreign countries can influence trust in elections. The reason this is so important is because there's a commonality of distrust across democracies in the world. Places where elections are very uncertain, have a history of fraud, people there are much less likely to trust elections than in other democracies. And international actors can actually do things to improve confidence in elections, like send international election monitors, which go around the world and monitor over 80% of elections in democracies today. On the other hand, we know democracies are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to international influence, and international actors can do things to influence those elections and destabilize trust in the system. Now, the United States in the 2016 presidential election experienced one of its first episodes of meddling in a long time. But of course, it wasn't the first in the US history of democracy. The first presidential election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson actually experienced profound international influence, specifically from the country of France. France was very interested in having a US president that would be allied to its interests. They noticed that Thomas Jefferson could be that friendly president. So what did they do? They released Adams' emails. Just kidding. But they did do something akin to what Russia did in the 2016 election. They tried to spread misinformation. They tried to use the media to influence the American electorate, even in the 1700s. What they did was they published op-eds in newspapers in Pennsylvania, which was the state that they thought would have one of the biggest influences on the election. And they tried to make the case that if the American public did not select Jefferson, that France was going to have a real problem with it. So even at the origins of our democracy, and at the origins of democracies all over the world, there is a problem with meddling. Now, my work tries to link meddling to trust in elections, and in particular, how meddling can interact with those factors that I explained at the beginning: expectations, institutions, supporting the winning or losing candidate. Now, what my research has found is really troubling for democracy. We know that losers have less trust in elections to begin with. Even if they have some trust, they're very uncertain about whether they should be trusting the result. And it turns out that meddling has the worst effects among losers. Now, the reason this is problematic is because democracy only works if losers consent to be governed by the rulers, or winners. We don't like to call them rulers. But if the losers aren't able to trust the results of the election, they're less likely to consent to be governed by the winners, and this risks the whole system falling apart. So what do we do about it? I think if you live in the United States, we're all looking for how the winners of the 2016 election are going to respond to meddling. And what we're seeing is somewhat troubling, but it is consistent with what we know about the psychology of individuals. So winners don't have an incentive to acknowledge that meddling even happened, and they definitely have an incentive to downplay that it happened, because it undermines the legitimacy of their election. This is exactly what we've been seeing even in recent days. Jared Kushner has gone on some of the morning shows last weekend and said meddling was only a couple of Facebook ads. Independent observers would suggest that actually meddling was much more widespread and more problematic for the election. But my research shows winners have every incentive to do this. At worst, though, winners might actually have incentives to normalize meddling. And this poses an even bigger problem because it actually invites future meddling. It invites foreign countries to undermine the will of the people. Again, we've seen this happen even just in recent days. Rudy Giuliani went on some of the morning talk shows and basically said he didn't see anything wrong with accepting information from the Russians. So the problem is that we have to convince winners that they need to go against their best interests, but act in the interests of democracy as a whole to respond vigorously to meddling when it happens. So hopefully my future work will shed light on how we can incentivize winners to take those steps. Thank you very much.
Those who can do and those who can't teach. It's my sincere honor to introduce Admiral Robert Thomas. He served as a career submarine officer, Commander, Submarine Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet, Representative West Coast, Commander, Submarine Squadron 11, and Commander, Task Force 7454 in Yokosuka, Japan. In his last assignment, Thomas commanded the U.S. 7th Fleet, and he assumed duties as director Navy staff in October 2015. We are honored to have with us, and it's my sincere honor to introduce Admiral Robert Thomas.
Thanks, Jesse. All right. As the professor of practice in this group, the esteemed colleagues actually invited me just for comic relief. And then we'll get to Professor Walter's remarks. What I wanted to do is just kind of walk you around our treaty alliances in Asia. And depending on how you count them, 5, maybe up to 9, you're only going to see one slide. And we'll just kind of do what we used to call a map walk. And those dotted lines matter. So like Colin Gray, the aging strategist and international relations expert, geography still matters. Remember, the lens that I'm looking through is a practitioner's lens. So this is the military efficacy of our allies. Do I think there's going to be major combat in Asia anytime soon? No. The probability is extremely low. But if the United States gets into major combat operations in Asia, they will be fighting most likely along with an ally. So, as we walk through it, the first one that you're tempted to look at, and Steven Haggard did a great job of kind of giving you the informational black hole that is North Korea, is probably our most effective military ally in Asia, and that's South Korea, the Republic of Korea. Frankly, the Republic of Korea's military is fully capable of handling a conventional invasion, if you will, restart of the Korean War at any time. First and Third ROK armies, the ROK Navy, ROK Air Force. Frankly, we do not need the US's 28,500 military personnel in South Korea anymore, from a military perspective. I'd probably save 7th Air Force, but frankly, the bigger issue geopolitically for our troops in South Korea is not about South Korea. It's about Japan. So let's look at Japan. Japan has an extremely capable and very, very large self-defense force. In fact, if you look at our allies, including NATO allies, and you negate platforms, am I still okay? See, that's the problem when you're the comic relief. If you're not getting any laughs, they just cut you off. So back to Japan, even our NATO allies, Japan has more capacity and more capability than any of those militaries. Now, they have an interesting restriction. They operate under a constitution that we wrote for them, which basically says, don't do anything off your home turf. Japan, for their part, though, the self-defense force, the Japanese Coast Guard, are standing up very, very well to the Chinese pressurization campaign in the East China Sea. Our third on the list is probably Australia. Australia, and you have to couple that with New Zealand. Militarily, capacity-wise, very, very small, but absolutely embedded in our US military. They're in our staffs. They go to our schools. They follow us on every misadventure that we can dream up and have for 100 years. It fascinates me. So long-standing, very capable, but low-capacity military. They will spend a lot of their time, and I think David Victor touched on this in the last hour, on effects of climate change in Oceania. Number 4 would be the Philippines. The Philippines is absolutely outgunned in the South China Sea. There's no comparison between them and the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, the Chinese fishing fleet. And so the Philippines has significant maritime security issues as that accumulation of advantage continues with respect to China. And finally, Thailand. Thailand is an interesting group in that, remember, we were very close allies until 2014. and then they went the coup route again. They had taken a hiatus from 2006 to 2014, and then we kept the relationship kind of on life support. You know, in concert with the State Department, the US Department of Defense kept it on life support with respect to military ties, and we still do a lot of exercises with Thailand. Number 6, somebody is saying, whither Taiwan? Over the last 2 years, that relationship is absolutely dynamic. Taiwan Travel Act, more mill-to-mill, military-to-military engagements. Very, very interesting when you also look at our defense contractors and foreign military sales, how much of that is pointed toward Taiwan right now. The last group I would like to point out is one that gets almost no attention. And I'm going to use an acronym called COFA, Compact of Free Association. So as you look at the map, you see Palau, you see the Federated States of Micronesia, and you see the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Marshall Islands. Those are compact states. We provide foreign aid, we provide preferred status for their citizens to come work and get medical attention in the United States. Per capita, they enlist in our militaries above any other country in the world, including the Philippines. And what is the return on that investment? The return on investment is that the US gets kind of first right of refusal with respect to military operations in and around the compact states. Why do I mention the compact states? 2 reasons. One, given the fish stocks in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, the protein wars are going east, and they will show up in the compact states. In fact, they already are. Illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing is a major problem for these particular nation states. The second one is a theme that you've heard again and again, and that is climate change. When I was a junior officer in 1981, there used to be a typhoon season in Oceania. There's no more typhoon season. It's year-round. Extreme weather, sea level rise is going to create not only challenges from a humanitarian assistance disaster response perspective, but an environmental refugee perspective that we haven't seen before. With that short walk around Asia, thank you very much.
Last but certainly not least, standing between you and happy hour is Barbara Walter. She is a professor of political science here at GPS, an expert in international security with expertise in civil wars. Her current research on the behavior of rebel groups in civil wars looks specifically at how extremism interacts with ubiquitous internet access in the world today, which is a question of major public policy importance, and no one does it better. Her current research is reflective of a larger research agenda which shaped my own research agenda. It is not an exaggeration to say that Barb has had more of an impact on my research personally and my trajectory as a political scientist than anyone. So I'm very, very pleased to think of her as a faculty co-member and my primary academic mentor here at GPS. She's on the editorial board of the American Political Science Review, International Organization, Journal of Politics, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and for those of you who don't read those journals, she also blogs at Political Violence at a Glance, which has won numerous blogging awards and is a great kind of public intellectual outreach that is an inspiration to all of us. So thanks. Barbara Walter.
So I'm going to bring us all back home. People keep asking me whether the US is going to experience a second civil war. And a few years ago, I would have said absolutely not. I've been studying civil wars for decades, and the US, until recently, had none of the factors associated with the outbreak of civil war. So I didn't think that Americans would fight each other again. That's changed. So we now know we now know the risk factors that are associated with the outbreak of civil war. And in particular, there are two big risk factors that exist, and I'm going to talk about them in a second. But both of those factors are emerging in the United States and have been emerging in the United States since 2016, and they're emerging surprisingly rapidly. So for the very first time, I'm beginning to worry. And I do think there is some possibility that the US might be heading yet again to another civil war. And I'm going to tell you why. There are two things that we now know about civil wars, two big things. The first is that civil wars are increasing, and they have been increasing since the end of World War II. What this figure shows you in light blue is the number of civil wars every year. The dark blue is the number of extra-systemic, or what we call colonial wars, and the yellow, which has all but disappeared, is the number of interstate wars. So what you see here is that civil wars have fairly consistently increased since 1946. They did dip in the 1990s, but since the early 2000s, they have reversed and they've been increasing over time. This graph only goes to 2016, but if you extended the data to 2017 and 2018, you would see that it has continued to rise, and in fact, 2018 was the most violent year in terms of civil wars since the end of the Cold War. So civil wars is not becoming a smaller problem over time. In fact, it's becoming a bigger problem. And those of us who study it do not think it's going to go away anytime soon. The second thing we know are what the risk factors are for civil war. This building is a picture of a building just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm a member of a task force. That task force is called the Political Instability Task Force. It's funded by the Department of Defense, and twice a year we meet in this building. And I Googled, actually, when I was preparing this talk last week, I was Googling on the internet to see what people know about the Political Instability Task Force. It's been around for over 20 years, and I found some really interesting articles. But my favorite quote was this, that PITF, which is what we call ourselves, is a clairvoyant squad of social science brainiacs charged with churning global political data into global instability forecasts. And this is the funny image that I found about what a brainiac looks like. So it kind of gets, we're not brainiacs, but our task, our job really is to create models that are able to predict the best that we can where and when countries are going to experience political instability and civil war. And it turns out that our model is actually not very complex, and that there's two factors in particular that dominate the model. And the first is what we call transitions to and from democracy. So most people believe that democratization is a good thing, and it is a good thing. The world would be a better place if all countries were mature democracies. Those countries, mature democracies, tend to be richer, more prosperous. Their citizens live longer. They also tend not to fight other countries. They're more peaceful. So when governments around the world advocate for more democracies, we tend to think that's a good thing. The problem is, countries almost never go from autocracy to democracy without some unstable and violent period in between. So what this figure shows you is the annual likelihood of what we call an instability event, depending on the type of political regime that's in power. And what you see here is that full democracies, those which we categorize on the right-hand side, we use a number system to categorize them, but full democracies are the least unstable, the least violent-prone countries. After full democracies, the most stable, most peaceful countries are actually on the opposite end. They are countries like North Korea and Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan. Many people assume that those countries are actually particularly prone to civil war. They are not. Why? They happen to often have very, very effective arms of political repression. It's really hard to rebel in those countries. Where we see most of the violence and the countries that experience most instability and most civil war are the ones in the middle. The ones that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. And in fact, what's interesting about this is you don't tend to get civil war and instability in the early phases of democratization. You actually tend to get it when they've almost reached democracy. And so one of the perhaps unknown tragedies, or maybe perhaps one of the surprises that most people and most policymakers do not know, is that by pushing for democracy in countries that had been autocracies, you are oftentimes inadvertently and unconsciously pushing those countries through a transition period in which they are at higher risk of civil war. Okay, I'm going to get back to how this relates to the United States. It also happens to be that if you're moving down this scale, if you're moving from full democracy down towards this middle zone, you are also at higher risk of civil war. And that's the trend that we have been seeing since the beginning of the 2000s. We are in a period of democratic decline, not just here in the United States, but in other full democracies around the world. Okay, so that's the first thing that we know. The second thing that we know is that if you are one of these pseudo-democracies, or you're in this middle zone, and your population also happens to be polarized, your society is divided along ethnic, religious, racial, or class lines, those are the countries that are most likely to experience civil war. And so it's this combination of being a pseudo-democracy, or some people, Fareed Zakaria likes to call them illiberal democracy, in societies that are deeply divided. Those are the countries where you really have to begin to worry. And in Washington, D.C., when we were talking about, we have a map up and we're looking around the world where we do think violence is likely to break out, those are the countries that we are looking at. Okay. This is where we come back home and we think about the United States. Both of these factors are increasing in the United States. Now, for years and years and years, the United States was classified as a positive 10. You don't need to know what that means, but that means that you are in the most mature, the most ideal type of liberal democracy. Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Canada, Australia, those are all categorized as plus 10 countries. And until 2016, that's where the United States was. In 2016, the US was downgraded to what was called a flawed democracy. And it is now in the same category as countries like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and South Africa. So our democracies on a host of different measures is weakening. Our institutions are weakening. And then in terms of polarization, we all know that the United States has become more divided over time. If you look, for example, at the voting record of Republicans in Congress, their voting record has shifted dramatically to the right. If you look at the voting record of Democrats in Congress, their voting record has shifted to the left. It's happening on both parties. Neither party is particularly willing to compromise. This is the definition that we use for polarization. And then this is a really good quote by a former senator, and I think he did aptly capture that tribalism is increasing in our country. He feared that it was potentially tearing it apart. So on both of these factors that we know has increased the risk of civil war in other countries around the world over time, both of these factors we're seeing increase here in the United States. So, what has been the result? We know that violence has also increased here in the United States. Now, the Fund for Peace is an NGO that measures of various things, mostly having to do with levels of violence. And last year in 2018, it put the United States on its list of most worsened countries for political violence. We know that the United States last year dropped more than any other country in the world on the Global Peace Index. It was at 103rd place, and it's now at 114th place. We know that there is an increase in every form of political violence since 2008. There's been a rise in mass shootings. There's been a 60% increase in small-scale attacks on U.S. citizens. We know that there's been a rise in targeted assassinations of politicians and their supporters. And then finally, we do know that the number of militia groups in this country has increased, especially since 2010. And it's estimated that there are now approximately 500 militia groups in the country. Most of those militia groups are right-wing militia groups. That is a change. It used to be prior. If you think back to the 1970s and the 1980s, most of the militia groups in this country, and there was a much smaller number of them, were left-leaning. Think about the environmental groups or Greenpeace, and today that's changed. Almost all of the growth has come in terms of right-wing groups. So, does this mean that I think we're going to have civil war in this country? No. Even the countries that have all of the risk factors, keep in mind that civil wars are still rare. Civil wars are rare events, but it does mean that we have to be conscious that we are going down a path that is potentially dangerous. And that we should be aware of this. And I want to end by basically putting the impetus on us moving forward. We as citizens have been the ones who are allowing our politicians to weaken our institutions, to weaken our democratic norms. We have been the ones that have allowed income inequality to happen, that have allowed fear-mongering to take place. We have been the ones who are allowing companies like Facebook to recruit extremists. One of the things I ask you to do is when you leave here, go on Facebook and Google extremist group or white nationalist group or the 3%ers. Facebook is the primary means by which these militia groups are recruiting supporters. So it's our own companies that are aiding this process. We are the ones that are allowing for the proliferation of guns. And so all of these things are leading to the conditions that potentially put our society and our country at greater risk of civil war. So I guess I'm going to end this by saying if we want to avoid civil war, we're the ones that have to take responsibility for it. We're the ones who have to hold our politicians accountable and press them to enact policies that will reverse the democratic decline that we've seen, that will reverse the proliferation of guns that we've seen, that will reverse the use of hateful speech and incendiary speech to continue to drive a wedge between us. And if we ignore these trends, if we don't hold our politicians accountable, we could be in a position where we do see increased political violence, and we might see another civil war. Thank you.
University is a great place to study the potential of civil war. You should see it when the faculty gets mad at each other. What you've seen today is what makes it a privilege to be the dean of this school. It's the fact that we have a faculty with unlimited curiosity and the skills and the discipline intellectually to pursue that curiosity. But it's not just that they're individually curious and they're tremendously able, it's that they also are truly a collective that shares their skills and their ambitions, help each other in problem solving, and create, in a sense, a new category of possibilities for investigation, not just of underlying problems, but thinking about different approaches to solutions. And that is a tradition that started with the early generation of this school, addressing the issues of the Pacific and its dynamics, and has continued in a sense as we have renewed ourselves over the years with the faculty that has joined the school in the 17 years that I've been dean. That is what a great research university does. Create those conditions. If you're lucky, and we've been lucky, maybe by prudence, maybe just by the good fortune of the people that, the personalities of the people that we've recruited and the way they've developed ethoses of cooperation among themselves. If you're lucky, it becomes more than the individual talents and specializations and subspecializations. It becomes a force that goes beyond any of those conditions. And that is what we have birthed at GPS. That's what we share in our education. That's what we're committed to sharing in service to society. Thank you for being here.